Stefan Kuhn lleva trabajando con el ICLEI desde 1996 y ocupa el cargo de director de gobernanza urbana desde 2002. Dirige la participación del ICLEI en cuestiones de gobernanza urbana en Europa y es responsable de estrategias y desarrollo temático, de defensa y de diseño de proyectos, gestión y supervisión. Es un experimentado formador y facilitador. Facetas que compagina con las de autor y editor de varios manuales, guías y otras publicaciones en el terreno de la sostenibilidad local. En los últimos años se ha encargado de la coordinación de la revisión mundial sobre sostenibilidad local en la preparación en junio de 2012 de la conferencia Río+20 de la ONU. El señor Kuhn nos hablará sobre los pasos que debemos dar tras la Cumbre de Desarrollo Sostenible Río+20. Mr. Kuhn, please.
Thank you very much for the very warm welcome and a good morning from ICLEI here in this conference that, as I just learned, takes place every 2 years. First of all, I would like to apologize for the inconvenience that you have to listen to my presentation in English, but you have translation and things. Yeah, taking stock and moving forward is the title of this presentation. Just have to check if this works. Yes. And that's also the title of the study that was just mentioned before I came to the stage. What we wanted to do in ICLEI was to sell the success story of Local Agenda 21 in Rio+20 just half a year ago from now. And of course, we wanted to come to Rio with large numbers and say so and so many thousands local governments are working on Local Agenda 21, so and so many in Africa, so and so many in Europe. But that didn't work. It didn't work because the diversity of local agenda processes in the world has increased so dramatically. So many different words and titles are used for that kind of work that it was impossible to count them. So what we basically did is we tried to describe exactly that variation, this variety of approaches that the mandate of Local Agenda 21 had taken over the last 20 years. And the surprising result was that we did not come to a typical European process or a typical African process or a typically Northern American process and so on and so on. But we found similarities between Poland and India, or between France and Korea. And then we asked ourselves, why is that so? Why have processes on the local level these similarities between even continents? And the simple answer to that question was because they're influenced by their initial drivers. So we tried to isolate a couple of initial drivers, meaning the forces that start local processes in a particular area and cluster the local agenda processes all around the world in 5 types. And I will try to give you a brief overview. The time wouldn't allow to talk in detail about these types today, but just to give you a brief overview, the first type that we identified we called local government strategy. It's the typical process where a local government starts saying we want to develop a sustainability strategy, invites the stakeholders, sets up a strategy and implements it. It's a type that we would find in some Scandinavian countries, but also, for example, in Japan. A second type that we identified we called the civil society initiative. It's a local process that is not started by the local government, but by the civil society in a place that says we want to develop a program for sustainability, and sometimes they're chasing the local government to come on board, but the initiative is coming from civil society. And one of the countries, surprisingly, where this was a typical case was Germany. The third type we identified we called concerted action, which is a type that is where the local processes are driven by a network, by a municipal association, a network like, for example, the Basque one, and I would also say that this is a type that the Basque country would represent. But we find this kind of type also in countries like Italy or the USA. And the next one, the fourth one, is national policy. So it's a local process that is initiated by the national government, by a national program. Could be a funding program, but not necessarily. It could be a guidance program. And we find this type of local sustainability processes in countries like France, Korea, but also, surprisingly, Switzerland, for example. And last but not least, the fifth type that we identified, we called international cooperation. This is where now the similarity between Poland and India comes into the play. So in many international donor organizations, the philosophy of Local Agenda 21 was built into their funding programs. And that means that countries or cities that received international development aid very often had to follow a path that was very similar to the philosophy of Local Agenda 21. So in these cities, the philosophy of Local Agenda came through international organizations. And that, of course, it holds true for all the countries that receive international aid. This is interesting, or you can say it's not so interesting. For us, the most interesting and surprising finding was that actually none of these types would work alone. It's not enough to just have a strong local government. It's not enough to just have a strong civil society. It's not enough to just have a network or a strong national government that says you have to do local agenda. And of course, an international organization is also not enough for a good local sustainability process. Basically, the idea is that this can be a checklist for local processes to be improved. And you have to have an element of each of the 5 types in a process so that it becomes very successful. So much about the study, which I wanted to start with, but taking stock or looking back over 20 years of local sustainability, we have to also face some other developments that have taken place in parallel to the development of Local Agenda 21 in the last 20 years. For example, the last 20 years were also 20 years of internet and mobile phones development. A completely revolutionized access to information. Small units can distribute information all over the planet. It's very difficult nowadays to control information, for example, also by authorities, and that has really changed the way how local initiatives can work. The last 20 years have also been 20 years of globalization of the economy, with the impact that national economies and also national governments have become a bit weaker in this whole play, that the markets have been liberalized, that formerly public tasks have been privatized, and now, as we can see, we have a debt crisis of public households and a bank crisis. This has also been the last 20 years. The last 20 years have been also 2 decades of decentralization. In Europe, that was not so important, but in many other parts of the world, many duties and responsibilities have been shifted down from the national level to the local level. However, not always the necessary resources have been shifted down as well. 20 years of population growth and urbanization have increased the pressure of unnatural resources. And the predictions say that in the next 40 years, we, meaning worldwide, the same amount of urban fabric, of urban capacity has to be built as the amount that we have already now. So the urban capacity will have to double in the next 40 years. And of course, you can easily guess the question whether this infrastructure, these buildings, these roads, these trains, whatever it will be, these houses, the question if these will be built according to sustainability standards or in a traditional way will probably decide whether the planet will survive or not. "20 years of climate change and environmental degradation are also behind us. And this is when I remember when we started in Rio 20 years ago, this was something very far away and very distant, somewhere in Bangladesh or in some islands in the Amazon area. And now it's here. It's coming to Europe. It's coming into our daily lives. Weather extremes like Sandy a couple of weeks ago are becoming normal news on the television. The Stern report has introduced a monetary valuing of action or inaction in response to climate change. Climate adaptation has become a new issue on the policy agenda also in the European Union. So this altogether, and there might be a few more, have been the developments with which people went to Rio+20 in June this year. And let me give you a few examples, a few impressions from this conference in order to better understand what the strengths and also the weaknesses of such a big conference can be. It was the largest UN conference ever, with more than 40,000 registered participants. And if you want to get a flavor of how this feels to be in a conference with 40,000 participants, maybe the thing that comes closest is you imagine you're on a large international airport and you're spending 5 days there. More than 190 governments and 9 major groups were working to agree on a common outcome document. Then the document called The Future We Want was adopted in its version of the 19th of June. However, the conference started only on 20 June. – 40,000 people coming together every day and leaving the venue every evening meant a total disaster in terms of traffic jams every day, but that is just an impression that I also wanted to share with you. But also, this was Rio+20. Thousands of people from hundreds of countries shared their visions of the future. Hundreds of side events, of discussions, of performances were happening every day over a whole week. Lots of inspiration from civil society mainly that gave you the impression, if you were just walking around a bit lost between all these many people, you were thinking, when you were watching this, whatever they will decide in the plenary room, the change will come anyway. And that is probably the most positive thing that I take back from the Rio+20 conference. The spirit of let's just do it, let's not wait until those on the top have decided, was probably for me, the most inspiring part of the conference. Generally, it can be said that civil society, the business sector, and local authorities were those actors that radiated some hope and also some action, especially in comparison to the more formal actors in the national states and so on. Local governments organized a so-called global town hall in this building, which was the pavilion of the state of Rio de Janeiro. And a lot of prominent speakers visited that town hall, which is already an indicator in itself. For example, Ban Ki-moon came to the global town hall and addressed the cities, and I quote him with one sentence. He said, of course, more than just one sentence. Countries are the sum of their cities. If the cities don't do well, the country can't do well. What you can see is that local governments gained an unprecedented appreciation from the national and the international level at Rio+20. Why is that so? Let me try and explain where we're coming from. Where we're coming from is basically, in the old days, there was a national economy and there was national government controlling, building the legal framework for this national economy. What happened then was that this economy globalized and got access to resources worldwide. At the same time, governance of the economy was not globalized. It was actually doing the opposite. It was decentralized. So the solutions, more and more, should be found on the local level. And that leaves, as you can see clearly, 2 white spots. And the first white spot is a global governance system that protects the global common goods. And that is actually mainly what the Rio+20 conference was working on. They were working on an institutional framework for sustainable development. They agreed to establish sustainable development goals. They introduced the concept of the green economy and so on. So this is one thing that Rio mainly did. On the other hand side, there is another blank spot in this graph, and that is that there has to be a relocalization of economy. And that means we need to work on a green urban economy that's based on distributed solutions rather than centralized solutions that has to be connected, or these distributed solutions have to be connected, and it's more participatory. We have to link technological process with social innovation and have to find new forms of creativity and new forms of management that would probably rather occur on the local level. Why is that so? You just have to look back. And if you're looking back at what has been the drivers of innovation in sustainable development, it has mainly been local initiatives and distributed technologies. Some examples: inner cities turned into pedestrian zones was never decided by any national government. The fact that you can ride a bicycle in European cities was never agreed on by the EU. It was something that the cities did by themselves. Car rental systems usually work on a local or regional level, not on a national level, and nowadays even more with high-tech technology. So this is an example where you can book your car just for a one-way trip through your mobile phone, which will be a reality in many cities in the near future. Houses that produce more energy than they consume, that was not in the building law of a country like Germany or Denmark or Spain. That was just some inventive people trying it out and building it and demonstrating that it worked. This is a concrete block made in the 60s with an extremely high energy consumption that was refurbished into a passive house building, meaning in effect that this building doesn't need a heating system now anymore. Distributed electricity production from renewable sources is something that is more and more organized on a local level with cooperatives and so on and so on. Or this way, we don't only have to look at Europe, it even enables people to get access to electricity if it's organized locally and not in a very large centralized solution. This is an example from a sun-powered LED street lighting in a village in Portugal, which would otherwise probably not have any street lighting at all. Another example are the local trading schemes and even local currencies that have been mushrooming in the last years that try and solve the other side of the sustainability and of the local sustainability coin, meaning to establish an exchange of services and time between citizens without having to go through the financial system. All these initiatives have one thing in common. They basically have a decentralized, a distributed approach, but they're connected with each other. And actually, this is following the model of the internet. What we've been establishing in the last 20 years for the resource of information now has to be transformed and transferred to other resources, not only information. So, for example, this is an example of urban gardening. Food can be one of those resources that can be produced either in very, very large farms, or it can be produced, at least on top of that, on the local level by the civil society, in the backyards, in the public spaces. Industrial raw materials will become extremely expensive in the next decades. You can see that already with some of the components of mobile phones, that they're becoming really difficult to get to the amount necessary. Well, we have a lot of resources in every city in the waste pits. They have to be mined again, and that can be access to resources in a distributed way. Electricity, of course, one of the most prominent examples. The electric car alone will not solve our mobility problems in the next years. But if the electric car, just for example, is also producing energy and feeding it into the grid while it's standing on the parking lot, that might be a contribution. So smart grids operated by thousands of people that act as producers and consumers at the same time, as so-called prosumers, could be a way out. And my last example is just a try. Why not? Why shouldn't we try and also find out if we cannot build up social security systems in a decentralized way, rather than waiting for the pension system to crash? The principle of all these initiatives is always the same. It's the crowd principle. And you have heard, I'm sure, about crowdsourcing, crowdfunding. The idea is that many small, flexible units are connected with each other and produce resources and manage resources in a networked way. Let's not leave the green economy to the multinational high-tech corporations and the infrastructure providers. Let's build a local green economy, cities that do not only consume resources and emit waste, but productive, creative human cities and citizens that become not only consumers of resources, but produce their own ones. That, I think, could be the way forward now following the Rio+20 conference. Thank you very much.